Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open. I was vacationing with my cousins in a Middle Eastern country when this happened. We were staying in an apartment complex that belonged to my great-uncle. It was not a hotel, and it was not some abandoned or run-down place. It was a real residential building where family members could stay when they visited. During the day, it felt completely normal. The apartment complex was in a busy area, surrounded by other buildings, streets, shops, and the usual sounds of people living their lives. From the windows, you could see cars moving below, lights from nearby homes, and the city stretching out farther than you could properly take in. It was one of those places that felt unfamiliar to us because we were visiting from somewhere else. But it was clearly familiar to the people who lived there. We had been there long enough to get comfortable in the apartment. We knew where the bedrooms were, where the kitchen was, which doors stuck when you tried to open them, and how the building elevator worked. The elevator was old and slow. It was not one of those modern lifts that arrives immediately when you press the button. You could press the button, wait, and still hear nothing for a while. When it did finally come, it made enough noise that you knew it was moving through the building. It also needed a card to operate. That was important. You could not just walk up, press a button, and take it wherever you wanted. You needed an access card. Whether that was because the building was private, because the upper floors were restricted, or because it was just how my great-uncle had set things up, I do not know. But everyone knew that the elevator did not move unless someone had the card. At least, that was what we believed. One evening, my cousins and I decided we wanted to go up to the roof. We were probably bored, which is how a lot of bad decisions begin when you are young. We had spent the day doing normal vacation things, and by the time the sun was beginning to go down, we wanted somewhere interesting to go. Someone mentioned the roof and said the view would probably be good from up there. That was all it took. We found the elevator and made our way up. The ride itself was slow enough to be annoying. The elevator made its usual mechanical sounds as it moved upward. There was the low hum of the machinery, the slight vibration under our feet, and the occasional pause that made us wonder if it had stopped between floors. But it eventually reached the top. When the doors opened, we stepped out into a hallway that led toward the roof access. The roof door was not especially dramatic. It was an ordinary metal door with a handle, the kind of door you might find in any apartment building. We opened it and stepped outside. At first, everything was completely fine. The roof was open and wide, with a view over the surrounding area. The air felt cooler up there than it did inside the building. We could see lights beginning to come on in the distance. Some buildings were still bright with daylight, while others had already faded into shadow. The sky was changing colors, and the city below us looked calm from that height. We stood around talking and looking over the edge from a safe distance. It was one of those moments that feels exciting when you are young because it makes you feel older than you are. We were away from the adults for a few minutes, standing on a roof at night, looking out over a place we were visiting. It felt like an adventure. Then we noticed something near the roof access. There was a loft area leading toward what looked like a small attic or storage space. At first, I did not understand what it was. It was not like a full second floor. It was more like a raised opening or upper section tucked above part of the rooftop structure. There was a ladder leading upward toward it. The ladder looked old enough that none of us felt eager to climb it, but it was there, and that made us curious. The space above it was dark, not just dim, dark enough that you could not see into it properly. The roof itself had some light from the city and the fading sky, but the attic-like area seemed to swallow that light. It looked like a black opening above the roof door, with the ladder leading straight into it. Of course, we went closer. That is another thing kids do. You see a dark place you probably should not enter, and suddenly everyone wants to be the one brave enough to take the first step. We stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked up. There was no light inside, no visible ceiling, no boxes that we could see, no sign saying what the space was used for. It could have been a storage loft. It could have been a maintenance area. It could have been nothing more than a small, unfinished section above the roof access. But the darkness in there made it feel wrong. One of my cousins climbed a couple of steps up the ladder, then another one followed. I think I took a step or two as well, though I do not remember exactly how far up I went. I remember looking into the darkness and getting a sudden feeling that I did not want to go any farther. There was nothing visible. That was the problem. When you stand near a dark opening, your mind tries to fill it with something. You start imagining that there could be someone standing just beyond the place where the light ends. You imagine a face looking back at you. You imagine a hand reaching down. You imagine movement in a corner that may not even exist. We started making nervous jokes. Someone probably said something like, "What if someone's up there?" Someone else may have laughed and told everyone to stop being scared, but the jokes did not make it better. They made us focus on the attic more. The longer we stood there, the more uncomfortable we got. Eventually, we decided we were done with the roof. We started moving back toward the roof door. The plan was simple. Go inside, close the door behind us, take the elevator down, and forget about the creepy attic. But before we could get to the door, the elevator opened. The doors slid apart with that familiar, slow, mechanical sound. We all turned toward it. For a second, nobody said anything. The elevator had arrived on the roof level by itself. That would have been strange in any building, but in this one, it felt worse because of the way the elevator worked. It was slow. It needed a card, and none of us had called it. We had been out on the roof. We had not pressed the button. We had not used the card. There was no reason for the elevator to be there. The doors opened fully. The inside was empty. No person stepped out. No one was standing inside. No one called from another floor. It was just an empty elevator sitting there with its doors open, waiting. That was the moment everyone panicked. Nobody wanted to stand around and ask why it had opened. Nobody wanted to get inside it. It did not matter that it was probably safe. It did not matter that the logical explanation might have been that someone else had used it from another floor. We just ran. Instead of taking the elevator, we sprinted toward the stairs. I remember the sound of shoes hitting the stairwell. I remember everyone talking at once, half laughing and half screaming. We were scared, but we were also trying to pretend we were not. That is what people do when they are young and something freaks them out. They laugh too loudly, make jokes, push each other to go first, and act like it is all funny because admitting you are terrified feels worse. We went down a few flights of stairs, maybe more. Then, once we were away from the roof, we started talking about the door. The roof door was still open. We had left it open in our rush to get away. At first, nobody wanted to go back. The idea of returning to that roof after the elevator had opened by itself felt awful. But then we started worrying about getting in trouble. It was my great-uncle's building. We were guests. Leaving a roof door open at night was probably not a good idea. Someone could get up there. Wind could blow things around. An adult might find it open and ask why we had been there. So after a while, we worked up the courage to go back up. We kept telling each other it was nothing. Maybe someone else had called the elevator. Maybe it had been on some automatic setting. Maybe someone had used their access card from another floor. Maybe the doors had simply opened because of a glitch. We said all the things people say when they are trying to convince themselves not to be scared. But none of us sounded fully convinced. We went back up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. The higher we climbed, the quieter we became. The stairwell felt different now. It was enclosed, concrete or tiled, and lit by weak overhead lights. Every floor we passed looked the same. Every landing echoed when we stepped on it. We kept expecting to hear the elevator moving somewhere in the shaft beside us. When we reached the roof level, we stopped outside the door for a second. Nobody wanted to be the one to open it. Eventually, one of us pushed it open. The roof looked the same as before. The city lights were brighter now because the sun had gone down more. The air felt colder. The attic opening still sat above the ladder, black and silent. The roof door was open exactly as we had left it. We stepped out only far enough to reach the door. Then, before we could close it, the elevator opened again. The same sound, the slow mechanical whir, the doors sliding apart. We all froze. This time, there was no pretending it was a coincidence. We had come up by the stairs. We had not called the elevator. None of us had a card out. There was no one else on the roof. And yet the elevator doors opened again, as if someone had pressed the button from inside or was waiting for us to enter. The inside was empty. I remember staring at it and feeling like the building had suddenly become much larger than it was. The hallway felt too long. The elevator felt too dark, even though its light was on. The roof door behind us felt like the only safe place, but even that was connected to the roof and the attic we did not want to look at. Someone shouted to close the door. We did. We pulled the roof door shut and ran down the stairs again. This time, there was no discussion about returning to close anything. We had closed it. That was enough. We got down to the apartment as quickly as we could and told everyone some version of what happened. I do not remember how much the adults believed us. They may have told us the elevator had a technical problem. They may have said another resident used it. They may have laughed and told us we were scaring ourselves because we had gone up to a dark roof at night. And maybe they were right. Maybe there was a completely normal explanation. But at the time, it did not feel normal. The elevator was slow enough that we would usually hear it before it arrived. It was not supposed to appear on a floor without someone calling it. And we were not just talking about one strange moment. It happened twice, both times right after we became scared of the attic. That night, we slept badly. We were all in the apartment, trying to act like we were not thinking about it. But every small sound made us look toward the door. Every time someone moved in another room, it sounded louder than it should have. The building itself made noises at night, pipes, doors, distant footsteps, the low hum of electricity, maybe the elevator moving somewhere far away. Every time we heard a mechanical sound, we thought of the elevator doors opening on the roof. Every time we heard wind outside, we thought of the attic opening. We talked about checking it out properly in the morning. That sounded much easier in daylight. At night, the attic had looked like a black hole above the ladder. But in the morning, we thought maybe we would see that it was just a storage area. Maybe there would be boxes or maintenance equipment. Maybe we would find out that the elevator had been programmed to return to the roof after a certain amount of time. Morning would make everything feel less frightening. At least, that was what we hoped. The next day, we gathered enough courage to go back up. We waited until it was bright outside. The building felt normal again in daylight. People were moving around. We could hear doors opening and closing. There were sounds from apartments, voices from outside, the usual noise of a place where people live. In the morning, it was easier to believe the whole thing had been exaggerated by darkness and nerves. We went back toward the roof. This time, we were more careful. We took the stairs, not the elevator. When we reached the top, the first thing we noticed was that the roof door was closed. It was not only closed, it was locked. That immediately confused us. We had closed it the night before, but we did not remember locking it. I do not even know whether we had been able to lock it from the outside. Maybe it automatically locked when it shut. Maybe an adult had come up later and locked it. Maybe the building staff checked the roof door at night. There were normal explanations. But after the elevator incidents, seeing it locked made us uneasy. We stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Someone may have gone to get a key. Maybe the door was not actually locked in the way we first thought. I do not remember every practical detail. What I remember is the feeling that the roof had changed overnight from a place we had casually visited to somewhere we did not want to enter again. Then we heard a sound from above, a whirring sound. It was coming from the attic area. At first, it was faint. It sounded mechanical, like a fan, motor, or something turning slowly. But it was loud enough that we all noticed it. We looked toward the roof door. The sound seemed to be on the other side. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then someone called out, "Is anyone up there?" There was no answer. The whirring continued. We called out again. Nothing, no voice, no footsteps, no sign of someone moving around. Just that low, strange mechanical sound coming from the attic space above the roof. Then the elevator opened again. The doors slid apart on their own. I remember how quickly fear came back. It did not matter that it was daylight. It did not matter that we were no longer standing on the roof near the attic. The sound of those doors opening brought everything back from the night before. The elevator had arrived. No one had called it. No one had used the card. The doors opened fully. It was empty. For a second, we stood there staring at it. Then we were done. There was no more curiosity, no more trying to prove we were brave, no more talk about checking the attic in daylight. We turned around and left. We went down the stairs as fast as we could and did not come back up. I do not remember whether we told my great-uncle or another adult every detail after that. I do not know whether anyone ever checked the attic or found a reason for the elevator behavior. Maybe there was a maintenance issue. Maybe someone else in the building had access to the roof and was using the elevator without us knowing. Maybe the elevator had a system that made it return to certain floors automatically. Maybe the whirring sound was an air conditioning unit, a fan, or electrical equipment above the roof access. All of those things are possible. But the timing was what made it hard to forget. We were standing near a dark attic opening, talking about how creepy it was when the elevator opened by itself. We ran away. When we came back to close the roof door, the elevator opened again. The next day, the roof door was closed and locked. We heard a strange sound coming from the attic. We asked if someone was up there, got no answer, and then the elevator opened again. It felt like something was reacting to us. I know that may not be what happened. I know buildings have electrical systems, elevators have faults, and old equipment can behave in ways that seem strange when you do not understand how it works. But when you are young, standing in a quiet stairwell outside a locked roof door, with an attic above you making a low whirring sound, and an elevator opens without anyone calling it, Logic does not feel very comforting. All you think is that you should leave. And that was exactly what we did. When I was in high school, I used to hang out at my younger brother's friend's house from time to time. It was an old farm property that had been in his family for generations. I do not know exactly how far back it went, but it was one of those places where everyone seemed to know who had lived there before them. The family had owned the land for so long that the old house, the barn, the driveway, and the fields all felt tied to their history. They had stopped farming years before I started going there. The fields were no longer being worked, and most of the old farm buildings had either been torn down or allowed to fall apart. By the time I knew the place, there were only two main buildings left from the original property: the house and the big barn. The house was old in the way farmhouses usually are. It had probably been added onto and repaired many times over the years. It was the kind of place where you could imagine generations of people living there, raising children there, coming in after long days outside, sitting in the kitchen, and going to sleep in the same rooms for decades. It was not necessarily creepy at first glance. It looked like a normal old family home. But it had a feeling to it that I never really liked. The barn was farther away from the house, across part of the property. It was large, sturdy, and had clearly been built for serious farm work at one time. But it had been changed over the years. The family no longer used it as a traditional barn. Instead, it had been converted into more of a finished pole building or workshop. It had roll-up doors, a concrete floor, fluorescent lights, and space for vehicles, tools, and projects. It was the kind of building where people could work on dirt bikes, ATVs, UTVs, trucks, or anything else that needed room and equipment. It was much cleaner and more finished than an old barn would normally be. From the outside, it still looked like a farm building. From the inside, it felt more like a large garage or shop. That was where we spent a lot of time when we were there. My younger brother and his friend liked working on things, especially anything with an engine. They would take apart parts of a vehicle, argue over what was wrong with it, search for tools, and spend hours trying to fix something that might only need 10 minutes of actual work. I was older than them, but I would still hang out sometimes. There was usually music playing, people talking, someone throwing a ball around outside, or someone sitting on a bucket or folding chair watching the others work. It was the kind of place where teenage boys could spend a whole evening without getting bored. We would hang out in the house for a while, then go to the barn. We would sit around, talk, mess with the UTV, look at whatever someone was working on, then go back to the house for food or to watch something. Nothing unusual ever happened when we were all together. At least, nothing that anyone talked about seriously. But I always got bad vibes from that property. I cannot explain why. It was not like I saw ghosts every time I went there. I did not hear voices. I did not see shadows moving in the windows. It was more of a feeling that came over me when I was alone there, or when I had to walk between the house and the barn by myself. I am not generally a nervous person. I do not scare easily. I have always been able to walk through dark rooms, go outside at night, and be alone without making a big deal out of it. I am not someone who sees danger in every shadow or believes every old building has to be haunted. But that place was different. Whenever I was away from the group, I felt uneasy. If everyone was in the house and I had to go out to the barn alone, I would feel like I needed to hurry. If everyone was in the barn and I had to walk back to the house by myself, I would find myself looking over my shoulder. I never liked standing outside between the two buildings after dark. The property was quiet in a way that felt heavier than normal. During the day, the farm looked ordinary enough. There were old fields, patches of grass, trees around the edges of the property, and the usual farm equipment or tools that had collected over the years. But once the sun began to go down, the whole place changed. The open land became dark and empty. The house lights seemed far away when you were standing near the barn. The barn itself looked huge from the outside, especially when only a few lights were on inside. The old fields stretched out behind it, and the tree line beyond them became one solid black wall at night. There was never one clear reason for my discomfort. Maybe it was just the history of the place. Maybe it was the fact that it had belonged to the same family for generations and felt older than anything I was used to. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the silence. A place can feel completely different when there are no street lights, no nearby houses, and no sound except wind, insects, or distant animals. Still, I always had the heebie-jeebies there. I would never say it out loud at the time because I did not want to sound stupid. Nobody wants to be the person in a group of teenagers who says an old barn feels haunted. People would laugh. Someone would make a joke. Someone would probably tell you to stop being a baby. So I kept it to myself. Then one night, when I was around 17 or 18, something happened that I still think about. It was around dusk. The sun was just setting, and the sky had that strange half-light where it is not fully dark yet, but you can feel the night coming in. The horizon still had a little color to it, but the shadows around the property were already stretching long. The house windows were beginning to glow from inside. The barn lights were on, but the area around the building was getting darker by the minute. We had all been in the barn earlier, working on my brother's friend's UTV. I do not remember exactly what they were fixing. It could have been something simple, like changing a part, checking a belt, replacing something, or trying to get it running better. I only remember that we had spent enough time in the barn for me to take off my sweatshirt and leave it somewhere inside. Eventually, we all went back to the house. Maybe somebody wanted food. Maybe people were tired of working on the UTV. Maybe the adults were there, or maybe we just wanted to hang out somewhere warmer and more comfortable. The details are not important. What matters is that we had left the barn and gone back to the house. After we had been inside for a little while, I realized I had forgotten my sweatshirt. At first, I considered leaving it there. It was getting dark, and I did not really want to walk back out to the barn. But it was not far away, and I knew exactly where I had left it. I probably thought it would take 30 seconds. Go out, grab it, come back. No big deal. So I told the others I was going to get my sweatshirt. Nobody came with me. I walked out of the house and headed toward the barn alone. I remember the air feeling cooler than it had earlier. The sun was low enough that most of the property was already covered in shadow. The last light in the sky was fading behind the trees, and the barn stood ahead of me with its large shape blocking part of the view. The walk was not long, but it felt longer than usual. Every step across the property made me more aware of how quiet it was. There was no wind. That is something I remember clearly now, because it became important later. The air was completely still. No branches were moving, no grass was bending, nothing was rustling. It was one of those calm evenings where the world seems almost paused. I got to the barn and saw that the roll-up doors were shut. That was normal. We had closed them when we left. The building was not open to the outside anymore, and the fluorescent lights were either off or mostly off inside. There may have been some light coming through the windows, but it was already dim. I went to the man door. The man door was the regular-sized entry door on the side of the building. It was how you entered when you were not driving a vehicle inside. I opened it and stepped into the barn. The inside smelled like it always did. Concrete, tools, oil, dust, old wood, and maybe a little gasoline. The UTV was still there, Tools were probably still scattered around where we had been working. The building was quiet now, without everyone talking and moving around. That quiet made it feel different. When a big space is full of people, it feels normal. There is noise, movement, laughter, music, and light. But when the people leave, the same place can suddenly feel much bigger. The fluorescent lights create hard shadows. The high ceiling seems higher. Every small sound echoes. You become aware of empty corners that you never notice when others are around. I walked over to where I had left my sweatshirt. I grabbed it. Then I headed back toward the man door. At that point, I was not panicking. I was uneasy, but I was still telling myself to stop being dramatic. I had been in that barn plenty of times. It was just an old pole building. There was nothing in there except tools, vehicles, and the same stuff we had been around all evening. I got to the door. I opened it. I stepped outside. I had one hand on the knob. Then, after just one step away from the door, it slammed shut behind me. Not closed. Slammed. The sound was violent. It was the kind of slam that comes from a door being thrown with force. The whole thing hit the frame hard enough that I felt it more than I heard it. The noise cracked through the quiet evening and seemed to echo across the property. For a second, I did not move. I just stood there. My hand had only just left the knob. I had taken one step outside. The door had not drifted shut slowly. It had not swung in the wind and bumped against the frame. It had slammed so hard that it felt deliberate. I turned around immediately. The door was shut. The handle was still. The building behind it was silent. There was no wind. That is the part I always come back to. There was no wind at all. The air had been dead calm. The trees were still. The grass was still. Nothing was moving. Even if there had been a little breeze, it would not have explained the force of that slam. The door did not simply close because of air pressure. It did not slowly pull itself shut. It felt like something had shoved it. I remember staring at the door for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to open it again and look inside. Another part of me wanted absolutely nothing to do with that building anymore. I had been close enough to the door when it happened that I knew how it felt. I knew how I had opened it. I knew the direction it swung. I knew I had stepped through it normally. There was no reason for it to slam behind me with that kind of force. I did not hear anyone inside. I did not hear footsteps. I did not hear someone laughing. I did not hear a tool fall or a vehicle move. There was nothing, just that slammed door. The more I stood there, the worse it felt. I suddenly had the strong impression that whatever had happened was not random. It felt like something was angry that I had come into the barn alone. It felt like I had crossed some invisible line by walking in there after everyone else left. I know that sounds dramatic. I know a door slamming can have normal explanations. Doors can stick, hinges can be strange, pressure can change, and sometimes a heavy door can swing faster than you expect. Maybe the latch or hinge had been acting up. Maybe the way I released the handle made it move. Maybe the building had some air pressure difference I did not notice. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All I knew was that I had stepped outside into completely still air, and the door had slammed behind me like someone inside had thrown it shut. I did not go back in. I walked back to the house. I probably walked faster than normal, but I did not run. I was too stunned to run. I remember holding my sweatshirt and trying to act like everything was fine. I kept looking toward the barn behind me, expecting the door to open again or expecting to hear something else. Nothing happened. The barn stayed dark and quiet. When I got back inside the house, the others were still hanging out like nothing had happened. Someone may have been watching television. Someone may have been talking in the kitchen. My brother and his friend were probably still discussing the UTV or arguing about what they needed to do next. I remember standing there for a second, not knowing whether to say anything. Then I told them what happened. I said the man door had slammed behind me. I probably added that there was no wind. I remember being dumbfounded more than scared at first. I kept trying to explain the force of it. I knew how ridiculous it sounded. A door slammed. That was it. People hear doors slam all the time. But I could not get across how hard it had shut and how still the evening had been. I do not remember everyone's reaction clearly. Someone may have shrugged it off. Someone may have laughed. Someone may have said the door always did that. Someone may have said it was probably the pressure in the building. That would have been the expected reaction. But even if other people did not take it seriously, I could not let it go. I had always felt something wrong at that place. Not enough to make a scene, not enough to refuse to go there, but enough that I disliked being alone in the barn or outside on the property after dark. And then the doors slammed. After that, I was even more uncomfortable when I had to go out there alone. I started noticing how different the barn felt when there was nobody inside. The fluorescent lights would buzz faintly overhead. The concrete floor would make every footstep sound louder than it should. The roll-up doors looked enormous when they were closed, like they separated the building from a huge, dark world outside. The man door itself became something I watched. Whenever I opened it, I would hold it longer than necessary. I would make sure it did not swing behind me too fast. I would step away carefully. Sometimes I would look back at it after I had left, almost expecting it to slam again. I do not think it ever did, at least not like that. But the one time was enough. It has been years since it happened. I was around 17 or 18 then, and I am 29 now. I have been in plenty of old buildings since. I have been alone in garages, workshops, barns, basements, and houses at night. I have heard doors move in the wind. I have watched heavy doors swing shut because of pressure changes. I have seen plenty of normal things that would have scared me when I was younger. But I still get goosebumps when I think about that night. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I had left the door in a position where it was ready to swing shut the second I stepped away. Maybe the building had an air pressure issue. Maybe the door had a loose hinge or a strange closer mechanism. Maybe some tiny movement in the air was enough to send it flying. I cannot prove otherwise. But there are certain moments where your body reacts before your brain can explain them. That was one of those moments. The sound was too hard. The timing was too perfect. The air was too still. And I had already felt uneasy there long before the door slammed. That may be what bothers me most. The door did not create the bad feeling. The bad feeling had always been there. Every time I was alone on that old farm property, I felt like I was being watched. Not constantly. Not in a way I could prove. Just enough that I never relaxed fully when I was away from everyone else. Maybe it was the age of the land. Maybe it was the old house. Maybe it was the barn, standing there as one of the last original buildings on property that had belonged to the same family for generations. Maybe it was just my imagination, built up from being a teenager in a quiet place after dark. But I still remember the exact feeling of stepping out of that barn with my sweatshirt in my hand. One step, then the door slammed behind me. Dead calm. No wind, no warning. It felt like something in that building had decided I had stayed long enough, and it wanted me gone. My grandparents bought their house in the 1950s. It was an older home, the kind that had already seen one family come and go before my grandparents ever walked through the front door. From the outside, there was nothing about it that would have made a stranger stop and stare. It was a normal family house in a normal neighborhood. It had rooms that had been lived in for years, an attic, a basement, windows facing the street, and the kind of heavy furniture people kept for decades. But the family who lived there before my grandparents had suffered a terrible tragedy. The husband had worked as a traveling salesman. He spent a lot of time away from home, moving from town to town for work, while his wife stayed behind with their 2 children. At some point, he found out that his wife had been cheating on him. No one in my family knew every detail of what happened between them, and I do not think anyone ever claimed to know exactly how things unfolded in the days leading up to it. What people did know was that he took his own life in the attic. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter was the one who came home from school and found him. That was the story my family knew about the house. It was not the kind of thing people talked about all the time, but it was never completely forgotten either. The attic always carried that history with it. Even if someone did not bring it up directly, it was there in the background. The family had moved on, the house had been sold, and my grandparents had made it their home. But the story stayed attached to the place. My mother grew up there with her brother, my uncle. To them, it was just their childhood home. It was where they came back from school, where they ate meals, did homework, fought with each other, played, had holidays, and lived their everyday lives. But according to my mother, strange things happened in that house from time to time. They were not always huge, dramatic things. There were no stories of objects flying through the air or voices screaming in the middle of the night. Most of what happened was quieter than that, which somehow made it more unsettling. It was the kind of thing that could almost be ignored if it happened only once. Furniture would be in a different place. My mother and uncle would come home from school and notice that chairs had been moved. Sometimes a table would not be sitting where it had been earlier. Things in the living room would look rearranged, not violently tossed around or broken, but moved as though someone had decided to change the room. At first, they probably assumed one of their parents had done it. That would have been the most reasonable explanation. Maybe my grandmother had cleaned, maybe my grandfather had decided to move something, maybe relatives had stopped by. But there were times when neither of their parents had moved anything, and nobody else had been in the house. The furniture had simply changed places. My mother also told me that she and my uncle would sometimes see a man sitting in a chair facing the window. That image has always stayed with me. It was not a figure standing in a doorway or rushing down a hallway. It was a man sitting quietly in a chair, facing the window as though he was watching the street outside. My mother never described him as doing anything threatening. He did not speak to them. He did not turn around and chase them. He was simply there. They would come into the room and see him sitting in the chair. Then he would be gone. I do not know how clear the figure was every time. I do not know whether he looked solid or faded, or whether he had a face they could recognize. My mother did not tell the story like someone trying to scare people. She said it as something that happened in the house when she was young. The fact that the chair faced the window always made the story feel sadder than frightening to me. I imagined someone sitting there in silence, looking outside like he was waiting for something or watching for someone to come home. Maybe that is only my mind trying to connect the story of the salesman with the figure my mother and uncle saw. Maybe there was no connection at all. But once you know what happened in the attic, it is hard not to wonder whether the man in the chair was the same man who had lived there before my grandparents. My mother and uncle got used to the strange things in their own way. Children can adapt to almost anything if it happens slowly enough. A house that feels frightening to a visitor can become normal to the people who live there. You learn which doors stick, which floorboards creak, where the cold spots are, and which rooms feel uncomfortable after dark. You stop reacting to every small thing because you have to keep living your life. Still, the stories followed them. There was one strange connection that came later in my mother's life. She became a teacher. Years after she had grown up and left the house, she ended up teaching the granddaughter of the woman who had lived there before my grandparents bought it. The granddaughter of the widow. That felt like a strange circle closing, even though it may have been nothing more than coincidence. People grow up in the same towns, attend the same schools, and end up connected in ways they do not expect. But knowing the history of the house made it feel unusual. My mother had grown up in the place where that woman's family had suffered such a tragedy, and later she taught her granddaughter. I do not know whether my mother ever spoke to the granddaughter about the house. I do not know whether the girl knew the full story of what happened there. I cannot imagine that it would be an easy subject to bring up. Some histories belong to families, and some stories are too painful to pass on to children in detail. But the connection was there. When I was young, we only stayed overnight at my grandparents' house once. That was something I noticed later, after I was old enough to think about it. My grandparents were part of the family. We visited them. We spent time there. We ate meals, had holidays, and came over like most families do. But we did not usually sleep there. As a child, I did not understand why. Children do not always notice patterns until much later. You accept what adults tell you. If your parents say you are leaving after dinner, you leave after dinner. If they say you are sleeping at home instead of at your grandparents' house, you do not necessarily question it. It is just the routine. But there was one night when we did stay over. I do not remember exactly how old I was. I was young enough that the house still felt large to me, but old enough to notice that things seemed strange. I remember the rooms having a different feeling at night. During the day, the house was just my grandparents' house. It had familiar furniture, familiar smells, family photographs, and the things that belonged to them. At night, it felt different. The rooms seemed quieter. The shadows seemed deeper. The house made sounds that were easy to ignore during the day, but harder to ignore after everyone had gone to bed. At the time, I did not understand that anything unusual was happening. I only noticed small things. Things that did not seem important by themselves, but began to feel strange when I thought about them later. A door that had been open would be shut. Then later, a door that had been shut would be open again. Things would not always be where they had been left. An object might be moved from the place where someone had set it down. A chair might not be exactly where it had been. Something small could appear in another part of the room. Chair might not be exactly where it had been. Something small could appear in another part of the room, and nobody seemed to know who had moved it. None of it was dramatic enough for anyone to scream. That was part of what made it unsettling. If a door slams hard in the middle of the night, you can blame the wind. If something crashes, you can look for a reason. But when a door quietly changes position, when something is moved without anyone remembering moving it, when the room feels slightly different each time you come back into it, it leaves you with nothing solid to explain. I remember feeling uncomfortable in the house, even though I could not have told you exactly why. It was not one terrifying event. It was more like a collection of small moments that made me feel like the house was never fully still. It was as if something always happened just outside the edge of your attention. You would turn your back, leave a room, go upstairs, come back down, and something would not be quite the same. At the time, I probably did not say much about it. I was a child. I did not want to sound scared. I did not know whether the adults would take me seriously. And because the things were small, it was easy to convince myself that I had simply forgotten where something had been or whether a door was open. But after that night, I began to wonder why we never stayed there. Eventually, I asked my parents. I do not remember the exact moment, but I remember asking why we did not sleep over at my grandparents' house more often. Maybe I had noticed that other families seemed to spend nights with their grandparents. Maybe I wanted to stay there because it seemed special. Or maybe I already sensed something strange and wanted someone to explain it to me. My dad was the one who answered. He pointed out how things seemed to happen on their own there. He did not say it in a dramatic way. He did not try to frighten me. He just acknowledged what I had already started to notice. Doors did not always stay where they were left. Things moved. The house had a way of making people feel uneasy. Then he told me about his own experiences from when my parents were younger. He had spent enough time around the house to notice things too. I do not remember every story he told me, but I remember the overall feeling of the conversation. He treated the place as something unusual, something that had its own strange rules. He was not claiming to know what was happening. He was not saying there was definitely a ghost in the house, but he had seen enough to believe that things did not always behave normally there. That was when all the smaller stories started fitting together for me. The furniture rearranged when my mother and uncle were children. The man sitting in the chair facing the window. Doors opening and closing on their own. Objects moved from where they had been set. The fact that my parents avoided staying overnight there. The way my dad spoke about the house like it was different from any other place. And the history of the man who had died in the attic. As I got older, I started asking more questions. Eventually, I asked my grandmother about it directly. I expected her to deny everything. I expected her to laugh, say the house was old, and tell me people imagine things when they know a sad story about a place. That would have been the easiest answer. Instead, she shrugged. Then she said, "You get used to it." That was all. No long explanation. No dramatic confession. No story about seeing the man herself. Just a small shrug and a quiet sentence that made everything feel more real. You get used to it. The way she said it bothered me more than if she had told some huge ghost story. It sounded like she had accepted whatever happened in the house as part of living there. Like doors moving, furniture changing places, and strange feelings in certain rooms were no more surprising to her than old pipes making noise or a floorboard creaking. She had lived there for years. Maybe she had decided that the best way to deal with it was not to react. Maybe she did not want to scare anyone. Maybe she had seen enough strange things that she no longer felt the need to explain them. Or maybe she believed there was always a normal reason and simply did not care enough to look for it. I never got a clear answer. The basement was another thing. I went down there 3 times in my life, and every time I hated it. The basement was not necessarily unusual in the way it looked. It was probably like many basements in old houses, unfinished or partly finished, with exposed pipes, old storage, concrete walls, and that damp smell older basements often have. But the moment I went down there, I always felt uncomfortable. It gave me a feeling I could not explain. The air seemed heavier. The light felt weaker. The sounds from upstairs seemed far away. I never wanted to stay down there for long. The first time, I remember trying to act normal. Someone may have sent me down to get something, or maybe I was following another family member. I went down the stairs and immediately felt like I wanted to turn around. There was nothing visibly wrong. No one was standing there. Nothing jumped out, but I felt creeped out in a way that made my skin crawl. The second time was the same. I remember looking around too much, checking corners and shadows even though I did not want to. I remember feeling like I should not be alone in that room. It was not fear of something specific. It was just the strong sense that I needed to leave. The third time, I barely wanted to go down at all. By then, I knew the history of the house. I knew about the attic. I knew about the figure my mother and uncle had seen in the chair. I knew that my grandmother's answer to everything strange was simply that you got used to it. That knowledge made the basement worse. I would stand at the top of the stairs and look down into it, feeling like the darkness below was somehow different from the darkness in any other basement. It did not matter whether the lights were on. The feeling was still there. I never liked it. Even now, when I think about the house, the basement is the place that gives me the strongest feeling of unease. The attic had the tragic history, but the basement was where I personally felt the most uncomfortable. Maybe that was because I was young and impressionable. Maybe it was because old basements naturally feel eerie. Maybe it was because I had already heard so many stories about the house that every creak and shadow felt meaningful. There are logical explanations for almost everything that happened there. Old doors can move because of changes in temperature, pressure, loose hinges, or uneven floors. Furniture can look rearranged if people forget where something was, or if another family member moves it without mentioning it. Objects can be misplaced. People can mistake shadows for figures, especially in rooms with windows and changing light. An old house will always make sounds. Pipes knock, wood settles, floors creak, wind moves through small gaps. A person can hear a noise in one room and think it came from somewhere else. All of that is true, but the house had a way of making normal explanations feel incomplete. It was not just one strange thing, it was the pattern. It was the fact that different people across different generations seemed to notice the same kind of activity. My mother and uncle experienced things as children. My dad noticed things when he was younger. I noticed things during the one night we stayed there. My grandmother had lived with it long enough to say that you got used to it. That is what makes it hard for me to write it off completely. I do not know whether the man in the chair was really connected to the previous owner. I do not know whether the tragedy in the attic had anything to do with the strange things people experienced afterward. It is possible that once a family hears a sad story about a house, every normal sound becomes part of that story. It is possible that the history changes the way people remember things. But I also know that my mother described the man in the chair before I was old enough to understand why that detail mattered. I know that my grandmother did not seem shocked by the stories, and I know that I never felt comfortable in that basement. The house may still be standing. I do not know whether the people who live there now have ever noticed anything strange. Maybe the activity stopped long ago. Maybe it was never anything more than an old home with old doors and a painful history. But in my family, that house has always been remembered as a place where things did not stay where they were supposed to. Doors shut when they had been left open. Doors opened after they had been shut. Furniture changed places. A man appeared in a chair facing the window. And after years of living with it, my grandmother's only explanation was the one that has stayed with me the longest. You get used to it. We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in Washington State, USA. When I say the middle of nowhere, I mean it. We lived up in the mountains, far from busy streets, shopping centers, and neighborhoods where you could look out a window and see other houses close by. Our home was surrounded by trees, open patches of land, dirt roads, and long stretches of woods that seemed to go on forever. Living there meant that wild animals were just part of everyday life. Seeing deer was normal. We had white-tailed deer coming through the property all the time. especially during certain parts of the year. Sometimes they would wander through the yard early in the morning. Sometimes they would show up around dusk, moving quietly near the edge of the trees. There were seasons when we saw the same young deer repeatedly, almost every day. They would come close to the house because my dad fed them and kept a salt lick out for them. Those yearlings became familiar. They were cautious, but not completely wild around us. They would stand in the yard with their ears twitching, watching the windows while they ate. Sometimes they would move closer than you would expect. Other times, they would disappear into the woods the second a door opened or a person stepped outside. But they came and went so often that deer stopped being exciting. They were just part of the place where I lived. We also saw bigger and more dangerous animals sometimes. Bears were not unusual. Cougars were around even if you did not always see them directly. Elk would pass through certain areas. There were also signs of animals everywhere if you knew what to look for. Tracks in the mud, scat near the trail, scratches on trees, broken branches, and the remains of animals that had been killed by something else. Growing up in the mountains teaches you that nature can be beautiful and brutal at the same time. You see animals that look peaceful from a distance, then you find a carcass in the woods and understand that nothing out there is soft or gentle all the time. You hear stories about predators. You learn not to walk too far alone at dusk. You learn that a quiet forest can hide more than you think. I had seen animal carcasses before. I had seen things that most people living in a city might never have to look at. I had seen bones, fur, torn up remains, and the kind of rough side of nature that makes you realize animals do not die peacefully in a clean, hidden place. One time, I even saw a random vulture feeding on a deer carcass. It was not a movie scene. It was just there, doing what vultures do, tearing at something dead in the woods. So I was not completely sheltered from disturbing sights. I had seen enough to understand that the wilderness could be ugly. But nothing I had seen before prepared me for the deer that appeared in our yard when I was around 16 or 17. Even now, years later, it is one of the most upsetting things I have ever witnessed. It was not supernatural. I do not think it was a monster. I do not believe it was some strange creature from the woods. It was a deer, a real deer. But there was something so wrong with the way it looked that my brain could not understand what I was seeing at first. I remember looking out into the yard and noticing movement. At first, I probably assumed it was one of the usual deer. That was the normal answer. Deer came through all the time. I may have been looking out a window casually, not expecting to see anything unusual. Maybe I was bored. Maybe I was checking the weather. Maybe I had just noticed movement near the edge of the yard and turned to look. Then I saw it. The deer was standing out there. At first, I could not process its shape. It was covered in huge brown lumps. They were not small bumps. They were not a few strange patches on its fur. These were enormous growths all over its body. Some looked as big as watermelons. They were large, dark brown, and swollen looking, hanging from different parts of the deer in a way that made its body look completely unnatural. For the first few seconds, I did not understand what I was looking at. My brain kept trying to turn it into something normal. I thought maybe it was covered in mud. Then I thought maybe there were leaves or branches caught in its fur. Then I thought maybe I was seeing some kind of weird shadow or optical illusion. But none of those explanations made sense. The lumps were too big, too round, too clearly attached to the animal. I remember standing there and staring for what felt like an absurdly long time. It may have only been a minute, but it felt much longer because my mind was struggling so hard to understand it. I had never seen a deer look anything like that. I had never even imagined a deer could look like that. The first explanation my brain came up with was giant ticks. That was how bizarre the sight was. At first, I thought the deer might be covered in huge ticks, or clusters of ticks, or some horrible mass of parasites. I knew that could not be right. Ticks do not get that big. Nothing about it made sense. But when you see something that looks wrong enough, your brain reaches for the closest explanation it can find, even if the explanation is ridiculous. I remember staring at those growths and trying to understand how they could possibly be there. They were all over it. Not one or two. Not in a single place. Its body seemed covered with them, like something had attached itself to the deer and kept growing until it became part of it. They made the animal look misshapen and uneven. In some spots, its normal deer shape was almost hidden beneath the giant brown lumps. It was one of the most grotesque things I have ever seen. I have seen disturbing things in my life. I grew up in the woods. I have seen dead animals, injured animals, predators, bones, and the harsh parts of nature that people usually only see in documentaries. But this was different because it was alive. The deer was standing there, breathing, looking around, moving, and its body looked like it had been taken over by something awful. The feeling that came over me was not just fear, it was despair. That is the best word I can use for it. I felt sick for the animal. I felt horrified by how it looked. I felt uneasy because I could not understand what I was seeing. It was like reality had suddenly become slightly wrong. I knew it was a deer, but every part of me was reacting as though I was looking at something that should not exist. It was one of those moments where you want to look away, but you cannot. You keep staring because your mind refuses to accept the image. I remember trying to work out whether I should call someone. I wondered whether I should tell my dad. I wondered whether there was something we could do. But the deer was outside in the yard, and it was still a wild animal. It was not like you could walk up to it, touch it, or help it in any simple way. And honestly, I did not want to get anywhere near it. The closer I looked, the worse it seemed. The tumors, or growths, or whatever they were so large that they looked heavy. I could not understand how the deer was still moving around. I could not understand how it could run if it needed to. I could not understand how it had survived long enough to get that way. The poor thing was probably suffering badly. That thought made it even worse. It was not just creepy because it looked strange. It was sad because it was alive and clearly not well. It looked like something terrible had happened to it slowly, over time, and there was nothing it could do about it. Then it noticed me. That was when the whole moment became even more disturbing. The deer lifted its head and looked directly toward the house. It looked at me. I do not know whether it could see me clearly through the window, but it felt like it could. It stopped moving and stared straight in my direction. Its ears were up. Its body was still. The huge brown growths on it made the shape of its head and neck look even stranger. For a solid minute, it just stared. It felt much longer than a minute. I stood there, frozen, looking back at it. I remember feeling like I should move away from the window, but I could not. I was too fascinated and too disturbed. The deer looked at me with that blank animal stare, but because of everything else about the scene, it felt wrong. It felt like it was watching me with more awareness than a normal deer would. I knew that was probably just fear talking. Deer stare. Animals stare. A deer looking toward a house is not unusual. But this deer did not feel normal. Nothing about it felt normal. The yard was familiar. The woods were familiar. Deer were familiar. But this animal seemed like it had stepped out of some nightmare and wandered into a place where I had always felt safe. Then it moved. The way it moved was strange, too. It bounded away, not slowly, not limping, not struggling along. It moved with these dramatic, eerie leaps, disappearing toward the trees. That was what made it even harder to understand. Part of me expected it to be weak. I expected it to move slowly because of how badly its body looked. I thought the huge growths would make it barely able to walk. But it did not just stand there helplessly. It sprang away with surprising force. It bounded across the yard in a way that looked almost unnatural because of the contrast between its movement and its appearance. Those massive brown tumors shifted with its body as it moved. The image was awful. It looked like something was wrong with the laws of nature, like the deer should not have been able to run like that. But it did. It moved in big, dramatic leaps, then disappeared into the woods, and I never saw it again. Not once. That deer passed through our property randomly and vanished back into the forest. It did not become one of the regular deer. It never came back to the salt lick. It never showed up with the yearlings in the spring or summer. It never appeared at the edge of the yard again. It was there for one horrible moment. Then it was gone. I have thought about it many times since then. There were plenty of deer that came through our property over the years. We saw the same ones often enough to recognize them. My dad would feed them. The yearlings would come around almost daily at certain times of the year. You could watch them grow a little bigger over the season. You could recognize the way they moved, the shape of their ears, the markings on their faces, the size of their bodies. Wild animals still felt familiar when you saw them enough. But that one deer was different. It did not belong to the small group of deer we were used to seeing. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods, somewhere we did not usually go. It appeared without warning, carrying something terrible on its body, stared at me through the window, then disappeared. That is why it has stayed in my head so clearly. When I was a kid living in the woods, I was afraid of a lot of things my imagination created. I was afraid of walking outside at night. I was afraid of hearing branches snap in the dark. I was afraid of seeing movement at the tree line. I was afraid of cougars, bears, strange noises, shadows, and every creepy story you can think of when you grow up surrounded by forest. Your imagination can make anything frightening when you live far from other people. A strange sound outside becomes an animal. An animal becomes something bigger. A shadow between trees becomes a person. A person becomes something impossible. As a child, I could scare myself with almost nothing. But the scariest thing I ever saw in those woods was not a ghost. It was not a shadow figure. It was not a monster. It was a real animal, a deer that looked so wrong that my mind could not understand it. That is what makes it worse, in a way. A ghost story is easy to put aside. You can tell yourself it was your imagination. You can tell yourself it was a trick of the light, a strange dream, a shadow, or something you misunderstood. But this was physical. It was standing in the yard. It was breathing. It was moving. It looked back at me. And it was suffering. I think that is why the memory feels so heavy. There was no mystery creature hiding in the woods. There was a real deer with a real problem that had become so severe that it changed the way the animal looked completely. It was a reminder that nature can create things far more disturbing than anything you imagine as a child. I remember the color of the growths, brown, dark, swollen-looking brown shapes all over its body. I remember how huge they were, watermelon-sized. That comparison still feels unreal when I say it. It sounds exaggerated, but that is how large they looked to me. Not small lumps, not the size of golf balls or apples. They looked enormous, heavy, and impossible. I remember the way my brain tried to make sense of them. Giant ticks, clusters of ticks, some strange parasite. Anything except the truth that the deer's own body had grown those horrible things. I remember the way it stared at me. I remember the awful silence of that moment, standing inside the house while it stood in the yard, and I remember the way it bounded away. There was something about its movement that felt theatrical, almost unreal. It was not simply running off because it had been noticed. It seemed to launch itself through the yard in long, exaggerated leaps. The growths made every movement look worse. Its body rose and fell in a shape that did not seem like it should be possible. Then it vanished into the trees. The woods swallowed it. That was it. No ending. No explanation that night. No return. Just an image that has never left me. I sometimes wonder what happened to it after that. I wonder whether it survived for long. I wonder whether it found water, food, shelter, or other deer. I wonder whether it died somewhere deep in the forest where nobody ever saw it again. I wonder whether anyone else in the area saw it. Maybe it wandered through someone else's yard later. Maybe another person looked out a window and felt the same shock I did. Maybe someone saw it near a road and thought it was some bizarre creature. Maybe it was found dead later, somewhere hidden beneath the trees. Or maybe it kept moving through the forest for much longer than anyone would expect. I will never know. All I know is that, after growing up surrounded by the kinds of things people are usually afraid of in the wilderness, the one thing that truly stayed with me was that poor deer. I had seen bears. I had heard about cougars. I had seen animal carcasses. I had watched a vulture feeding on a dead deer. I had spent nights looking out at the woods and imagining all kinds of horrible things hidden between the trees. But the worst thing I ever saw was real. It was alive. It was looking back at me, and it was covered in giant brown tumors. Even now, that image is stored somewhere deep in my mind. It is one of those memories that you do not think about for years, then something brings it back, and you feel the same wave of disgust and unease all over again. A deer in the yard should have been normal. At my house, deer in the yard were normal, but that deer was not. It came through once, looked at me, bounded back into the woods, and disappeared forever. And I do not think I will ever forget it. When I was younger, I worked at the Hawaii Convention Center. It was a big place, much bigger than people probably realize unless they have been inside it. There were large halls, long service corridors, storage areas, back rooms, loading spaces, stairwells, and all the hidden parts of the building that visitors never really see when they come for an event. Most people only see the bright public areas. They see the big rooms, the signs, the displays, the polished floors, the crowds, and the lights. But when you work somewhere like that, you learn the building has a completely different side. There are quiet hallways that seem to go on forever, rooms with no windows, service doors that lead to other service doors, and areas where the sounds of the public spaces disappear completely. One of the places I had to go sometimes was the basement. I do not remember exactly what I had to get from down there each time. It could have been supplies, equipment, storage items, or something related to my job. Whatever the reason, I had to make that trip often enough that I knew the route well. The basement itself was not necessarily scary during the day when people were around. It was just a basement. It had the usual feeling that large building basements have: concrete walls, pipes, low mechanical sounds, storage areas, and that slightly damp, cool air that never seems to match the temperature upstairs. But there was one thing about getting down there that always bothered me. One of the stairways had the light switch at the bottom of the stairs instead of at the top. I still do not know why it was designed that way. Maybe it made sense to whoever planned the building. Maybe there was a reason connected to maintenance, security, or the electrical setup. But from the point of view of someone who had to walk down those stairs, it was annoying and creepy. You would open the stairwell door, step inside, and immediately be in darkness. Not the soft kind of darkness where you can still see the shapes of the steps clearly. It was the kind where your eyes had to adjust. You could make out the railing, maybe the outline of the wall, and the faint difference between one step and the next. But it was still dark enough that you had to be careful. This was before everyone had a phone with a flashlight built into it. Now, if you have to walk into a dark stairwell, you pull out your phone and shine a light ahead of you. Back then, at least for me, that was not an option. I did not have a flashlight in my pocket. I did not carry a little keychain light. I just had to use what little light came through the open door before it closed behind me. There was another way down, but it took longer. That route was probably better lit and safer, but it was also more of a hassle. It meant taking a longer path through the building, going through other corridors, and wasting extra time when all I needed was something simple from the basement. So most of the time, I took the short stairway. I had done it plenty of times. I knew exactly where the light switch was. That became part of the routine. I would step into the dark stairwell, hold the railing, carefully walk down, and keep my hand close to the wall. I knew that once I reached the bottom, the switch would be right above the end of the railing. I did not need to see it. I could find it by memory. The railing ended at a certain point. My hand would follow it down. Then I would lift my arm up just a little, feel for the switch, and turn on the lights. After doing it enough times, it became automatic. I would walk down, reach up, hit the switch, and suddenly the stairwell would be bright again. Then I would continue on with whatever I needed to do. Most of the time, nothing happened. The stairwell was quiet. The basement was quiet. I would get my stuff, go back upstairs, and forget about it. But one time something happened that I still think about. It was just another normal day at work. I had to go down to the basement for something. I do not remember if it was late in the day or early in the morning. I do not remember whether the building was busy or mostly quiet. I only remember that I was alone when I went into that stairwell. I opened the door. The stairwell was dark, just like always. I started walking down. At first, nothing felt different. I held the railing and went down carefully, step by step. I knew the path. I knew the number of steps well enough that I did not have to count them. The darkness did not scare me anymore because I had done it so many times. I was focused on getting to the bottom, turning on the lights, grabbing what I needed, and getting back upstairs. As I got close to the bottom, I reached my hand forward along the railing. I knew the light switch was right above where the railing ended. I had done this exact movement many times before. My hand reached the end of the rail, then I lifted my arm toward the wall, and I could not move it. At first, I did not understand what was happening. It felt like there was heavy air around my arm. That is the only way I can describe it. It was not like I saw a hand grabbing me. It was not like something physically held my wrist. There was no visible person standing in front of me. There was no object blocking the light switch. But when I tried to lift my arm, it felt like I was pushing against something thick and heavy. It was almost like the air itself had weight. I tried again. My arm would not go up. I remember standing at the bottom of those stairs in complete darkness, with one hand still near the end of the railing, trying to understand why I could not lift my other arm high enough to hit the switch. The first thought that went through my mind was not, "There is a ghost here." I did not immediately jump to the most dramatic explanation. I thought maybe I had the wrong spot. Maybe I was not standing where I thought I was. Maybe I had reached the bottom of the railing too early. Maybe the switch was a little farther over than I remembered. Maybe I was trying to lift my arm in the wrong direction, and the wall was closer than I expected. Those were the things I told myself. I thought maybe something was above where I was reaching. Maybe a pipe or a box or some part of the wall was in the way. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe I was getting turned around in the dark. I kept trying to move my arm, but the feeling was still there. It was like trying to lift your arm through deep water. Not impossible exactly, but difficult in a way that made no sense. There was resistance, heavy resistance. It felt like something was pressing down around my arm and keeping it from rising. The darkness made it worse. If the lights had been on, maybe I could have looked and seen what was happening. Maybe I would have noticed some normal reason right away. But I was standing in a dark stairwell, alone, unable to reach a light switch that I had reached without thinking many times before. I could not see anything. I could not feel anything solid. I could only feel that strange pressure. For a few seconds, I kept trying to stay calm. I thought, maybe I am not reaching high enough. I thought maybe the switch is farther to the left. I thought maybe I am just being stupid. I moved my hand around a little, trying to find a different angle. Nothing. The air around my arm still felt thick. It was not cold exactly. It was not hot. It was just heavy. I remember feeling a slow wave of discomfort start to build in my chest. It was that moment when you are trying to stay logical, but the logical explanations are not working anymore. I knew the stairwell. I knew where the switch was. I knew I was at the bottom. I knew there should have been nothing there. And still, my arm would not go up. Then, suddenly, the pressure was gone. There was no warning, no sound, no movement that I could see. One moment, it felt like my arm was being held down by something invisible. The next moment, it moved normally. I lifted my hand up. My fingers found the switch immediately. I flipped it on. The lights came on. The stairwell was empty. There was nothing above my arm. There was no pipe, no box, no hanging object, no person standing in front of me, no equipment in the way, no reason at all that I could see for why I had not been able to move my arm a second earlier. I stood there for a moment with the lights on, staring at the wall and the space above the railing. Everything looked completely normal. That was when it really hit me. While I was in the dark, I could tell myself that I had made a mistake. I could tell myself I was reaching in the wrong place. I could imagine that something was in the way. I could assume the darkness was making me confused. But once the light came on, there was nothing. Nothing had been blocking me. Nothing had been above the switch. Nothing was touching my arm. The stairwell was exactly the same as it had always been. I remember feeling a chill run through me. Not because I had seen something, I had not. Not because I heard a voice, I had not. It was because the moment had become more real after the lights came on. In the dark, you can doubt yourself. In the light, you look at the empty space and realize you do not have an answer. I did not stand there long after that. I got whatever I had gone down there to get, then I went back upstairs. I do not remember whether I told anyone right away. I might have kept it to myself at first because it sounded so strange. What was I supposed to say? Something invisible would not let me lift my arm to turn on the lights? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. I was not trying to make a ghost story. I was not someone who ran around telling people every strange feeling meant something paranormal. I had been in that stairwell many times. I knew the routine. I knew how the space worked. That was why it bothered me. It was not new. It was not unfamiliar. It was not some abandoned building where I expected to get scared. It was a normal work stairwell that I had used over and over again. And for a few seconds, it felt like something did not want me to turn the light on. I have tried to think of normal explanations. Maybe my arm cramped up. Maybe I was holding my body at a strange angle. Maybe I had bumped into the wall without realizing it. Maybe I got disoriented in the dark and felt resistance that was not really there. Maybe I was tired, stressed, or distracted. All of those things are possible. But the feeling was so specific that it has stayed with me. It did not feel like weakness in my arm. It did not feel like a muscle problem. It felt like something around my arm was pressing it down. The pressure was outside of me. That is what made it unsettling. And then, once it disappeared, my arm moved perfectly fine. No pain, no numbness, no stiffness, nothing, just a normal arm again, reaching up and hitting the switch exactly where it was supposed to be. That was the only time anything like that happened to me in that stairwell. Afterward, I still had to go down there sometimes. I did not have a choice. It was part of my job. But I was more aware every time I used those stairs. I would stand at the top for a second before going down. I would make sure I had my hand on the railing. I would listen for sounds below me. I would move a little faster than usual toward the bottom. And when I reached the end of the rail, I would reach for the switch quickly. I did not want to stand there in the dark again. I never had the same feeling a second time, at least not in that stairwell. But that one incident was enough. It made me think differently about dark spaces. A dark stairwell is already uncomfortable because your imagination has room to work. You cannot see what is around you. You do not know whether something is at the bottom. You hear the building settling, pipes moving, air systems humming, and every small sound seems louder than it should. But when you feel something physical in the dark, something you cannot explain once the lights are on, it is harder to forget. There was another experience I had in Hawaii that people there sometimes call a hold-down ghost. I had heard that term before. In Hawaii, people sometimes talk about waking up in bed and feeling like something is holding them down. You are awake enough to know you are in your room, but you cannot move your body. It feels like there is a weight on your chest or over your whole body. Some people feel pressure. Some people feel fear. Some people think there is something in the room with them. I had that happen once too. I was in bed, and I woke up feeling like I could not move. It was not the same as being tired. It was not that lazy, heavy feeling where you wake up and do not want to get out of bed. It was like my brain had woken up before the rest of me had. I could think. I could feel that I was in bed. I knew I wanted to move, but my body would not respond. There was a heavy feeling on me, almost like something was pressing me into the mattress. I remember trying to move my arms or legs and not being able to. I remember feeling panic start to rise because it is terrifying when your body does not do what you tell it to do. The experience did not last forever, but it felt long. When you cannot move, even a few seconds feels like a long time. You start trying harder. You focus on your fingers. You try to breathe normally. You try to force yourself to sit up. You start wondering whether you are dreaming. Then, eventually, I could move again. Just like that, the pressure was gone. I could sit up. I could move my arms. I could move my body normally. That experience was frightening too, but I have heard and read different explanations for it. Some people call it a hold-down ghost. Others call it sleep paralysis. Some say it can happen when your body is still partly asleep while your mind wakes up. I have also read people connecting similar experiences with breathing problems or sleep-related issues. I do not know exactly what caused mine. I am not saying it was definitely a ghost. I am not saying it was definitely some medical thing either. I only know what it felt like. It felt like something was holding me down. The stairwell experience was different because I was completely awake and at work. I was standing on my feet. I was not dreaming. I was not in bed. I was not half asleep. I was walking down a familiar set of stairs in a place I had been many times. That is why it has stayed with me all these years. The Hold Down ghost experience was scary, but I can understand how the mind and body might create something like that during sleep. Sleep is strange. Dreams are strange. The line between waking and sleeping can get blurry, but standing alone in a basement stairwell, reaching for a switch, and feeling like the air itself will not let your arm move, that is harder for me to explain. I have told the story before, and people usually react in different ways. Some people immediately say it was a ghost. Some people say it was probably just the building, the darkness, and my imagination. Some people say I must have been reaching wrong. Maybe they are right. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation, and I just did not understand it in the moment. But I know how it felt. I know I had used those stairs many times. I know I knew exactly where that switch was. I know the stairwell was empty once the lights came on. And I know that for a few seconds, I could not move my arm upward, no matter how hard I tried. I did not see anything. I did not hear anything. No shadow passed by me. No voice spoke. No hand grabbed me. It was just darkness, a railing, an unseen light switch, and a pressure that should not have been there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was one weird moment in an old stairwell. But whenever I think about it, I can still feel that heavy air around my arm, and I still remember how relieved I was when the light finally came on. In my city, there is a ravine that most people probably never see unless they know exactly how to reach it. It sits along the coast and can only be accessed from the beach when the tide is out. When the tide is high, the water cuts off the way in, and there is no easy path around the top because the sides of the ravine are extremely steep. The walls rise somewhere around 150 to 200 feet above the ground below. They are almost straight up in places, maybe 80 degrees or more. From the bottom, the sides look like dark cliffs covered in dirt, roots, wet moss, and thick plant growth. It does not feel like a normal hiking trail or a place where people are supposed to spend time. It feels hidden. When the tide is low enough, you can walk along the beach and reach the mouth of the ravine. The opening is narrow compared to the open shoreline, and once you enter it, the sound of the ocean starts to fade behind you. The beach is still close, but the high walls block your view of almost everything else. When I was younger, that made it feel exciting. My friends and I were probably in our early teens when we started exploring places like that. We were old enough to roam around without adults watching every step, but young enough to think that being somewhere dangerous or forbidden automatically made it interesting. We would hear about abandoned places, old tunnels, strange paths through the woods, forgotten structures, and anything that sounded hidden from normal life. The ravine was one of those places. It had a reputation among kids because it was difficult to get to, and because it contained huge sections of old cement pipe. They were massive, much larger than normal drainage pipes. They had probably been part of some old construction project or a long abandoned drainage system. Nobody we knew seemed to have a clear answer for why they were there or what they had been used for. The pipes were scattered and broken throughout the ravine. Some were lying on their sides. Some were partly buried in the dirt. Some were cracked or split open. Others had been pushed against the walls or sunk into the ground over time. They were large enough that a person could climb inside and walk through them, although you usually had to stoop over because the ceiling was low. As kids, we thought that was amazing. We would climb around them, duck through the openings, and use them like tunnels. The concrete was cold and damp inside. Moss grew around the edges. Water dripped from cracks in some places. The walls smelled like wet dirt and old stone. Sounds changed when you stepped inside one. Your own footsteps echoed strangely, and voices from outside became muffled. There was always a little bit of danger to it. The ground was uneven. The ravine walls were steep. The tide could come back in if you stayed too long. The pipes were old, broken, and sometimes unstable looking, but none of that mattered much to us at the time. We were kids, and being told a place was dangerous only made it seem more worth exploring. I remember the ravine feeling different from the rest of the beach. On the beach, you could see the sky, the water, other people walking in the distance, and the open horizon. Even when you were alone, it did not feel completely cut off from the world. Inside the ravine, it was different. The walls blocked the light. Trees and brush grew above us, and roots hung down from the dirt. The old cement pipes created dark openings everywhere. You could be standing only a few minutes away from a public beach, but it felt like you had stepped into a place nobody was meant to find. That day, my friends and I were exploring like we usually did. We moved deeper into the ravine, talking loudly at first, climbing over broken pipe sections and looking into every opening we could find. I do not remember how many of us were there, but there were enough that we felt safe. Nobody wanted to go into the darker places alone, but with a group, we were brave. At some point, we found one pipe that looked different from the others. It was almost completely sunken into the ground. Most of the pipes we found were open or broken. You could see right through them or tell immediately that they were empty. This one was buried so deeply that only one end was visible. The opening pointed slightly upward, angled toward us from the dirt. It looked like the earth had slowly swallowed it. At first, we may not have even realized it was a pipe. There was so much moss, dirt, and plant growth around it that it blended into the ravine floor. But when we got closer, we could see the circular concrete edge. Then we noticed it had been blocked. Someone had covered the opening with a piece of plywood. The plywood was held in place by a 2x4 and a padlock. That was the first thing that made us stop treating it like a normal abandoned pipe. The wood was old. It was rotten in places and dark with moisture. Moss had grown over parts of it. The 2x4 looked weathered and weak, like it had been sitting there for years. The padlock was rusty and dull. It did not look new, but it had been put there on purpose. Someone had made an effort to keep the pipe closed. I do not know what we thought was inside. Probably nothing specific. Maybe we expected old tools, trash, stolen stuff, or some kind of hidden storage. When you are young and exploring abandoned places, your mind goes to simple possibilities. You imagine that someone used it as a hiding spot. Maybe somebody had put camping gear inside. Maybe there were old bottles, old newspapers, or junk left behind from years earlier. But the fact that it was locked made it feel like a secret. We stood around looking at it. Someone probably said we should open it. Someone else probably hesitated. I do not remember who kicked it first, but eventually we did. The plywood was so rotten that it did not take much force. The wood cracked and gave way. The 2x4 shifted. The old barrier came apart enough for us to look inside. The padlock may have still been attached to part of the broken wood, but it no longer mattered. The entrance was open. The first thing I remember noticing was the color. Pink. There was a child's puffy pink jacket inside the pipe. It was not something vague that could have belonged to anyone. It was clearly a child's jacket. It was small. It had the soft, padded look that children's winter jackets have. Even in the dim light, the bright pink color stood out against the gray concrete and dark dirt. For a second, I think we just stared at it. Then we saw the shoes. They were pink and white shoes with Velcro straps. Small shoes. Children's shoes. They were sitting inside the pipe near the jacket. Then we saw the bike. It was pink and purple. and it had been broken down into pieces. At first, I did not fully understand what I was looking at. It was not sitting there as a complete bike. It looked like it had been taken apart and placed inside. There were pieces of the frame, wheels, and parts scattered or stacked in the pipe. Everything about it felt wrong. It was not like finding a pile of abandoned toys or random trash. The jacket, the small shoes, and the broken-down bike all seemed to belong together. They all looked like they belonged to the same little girl, or at least to a child around the same age. The pipe was hidden. The entrance had been blocked. The wood had been held shut with a 2x4 and a padlock, and inside were belongings that should not have been there. I remember the feeling changing immediately. A few seconds earlier, we had been kids exploring an old ravine, excited that we had found something hidden. Then we were standing around a dark pipe in the ground, staring at things that made the whole situation feel serious. Nobody touched anything. That is one thing I remember clearly. We did not go inside. We did not pick up the jacket. We did not move the shoes. We did not take pictures, at least not that I remember. This was more than 20 years ago, long before everyone carried a phone with a camera in their pocket. We were not documenting everything the way people do now. We were just standing there, confused and scared. We knew enough to understand that we should not touch it. I do not know whether one of us had seen enough crime shows or had a parent who worked in law enforcement, but somebody said we should tell the police. That was the first sensible thing anyone said. So that is what we did. We left the ravine. I remember walking back out feeling completely different from the way I had felt going in. Earlier, the ravine had seemed like a place for adventure. It had been creepy in a fun way. The dark pipes had been interesting. The steep walls had been exciting. After finding those things, every part of the place felt wrong. The pipes no longer seemed like tunnels to crawl through. They looked like places where someone could hide something. The trees and steep ravine walls no longer made the place feel private and adventurous. They made it feel isolated. The path back to the beach felt longer than it had before. I remember looking around more carefully as we walked. I remember not wanting to be the last person in the group. I remember thinking about how nobody on the beach would know what was hidden only a short distance away inside that ravine. Once we got back to where we could contact someone, we alerted the police. I do not remember every detail of how that happened. I do not remember whether we called from a home, told an adult first, or found an officer nearby. I only remember that the police were told about what we found. We told them there was a blocked pipe in the ravine. We told them it had been sealed with old plywood, a 2x4, and a padlock. We told them there was a pink child's jacket, small pink and white Velcro shoes, and a broken pink and purple bike inside. Then we waited to hear something. But we never did. I do not know what happened after the police arrived. I do not know whether they found the same things where we saw them. I do not know whether they took the belongings away. I do not know whether they traced them to anyone. I do not know whether there had ever been a report about a missing child, a stolen bike, or anything else connected to it. We never heard another word. Maybe the police investigated and found an ordinary explanation. Maybe the items belonged to a child who had lived nearby years before. Maybe someone had hidden them there after stealing them. Maybe it was just a strange dump site. Maybe a family had thrown away old things and someone else had locked the pipe for reasons we did not understand. There are possible explanations, but none of them has ever made the discovery feel normal to me. Why were those things inside a pipe that had been almost completely buried? Why was the opening blocked? Why was it held shut with wood and a padlock? Why were the things inside all small, bright, and clearly connected to a child? And why had they been broken down and hidden instead of simply thrown away? Those questions are what stayed with me. At the time, I did not have the words to understand how bad it looked. I was young. We were all young. We knew it was disturbing, but I do not think we understood all the possibilities. We knew we had found something that adults should see. We knew we should not touch it. We knew the police needed to be told. But I do not think any of us fully understood why it made our stomachs drop. As I got older, I thought about it more. I started to imagine different reasons those things might have been there. Some were harmless, some were not. The worst possibilities are the ones that have stayed with me, even though I have no proof that anything terrible happened. That is the hard part. There was no ending. There was no news story that I ever saw. No officer came back to tell us that it had been solved. No one told us the jacket belonged to a child who had simply lost it years earlier. No one said the bike had been stolen and recovered. No one said it was a prank. No one said it was nothing. We found it, reported it, and then the story disappeared. I still think about that little girl sometimes, not because I know who she was. I do not. I do not even know for sure that there was a girl connected to those things. The clothes and bike could have belonged to someone else. They could have been dumped there for reasons that had nothing to do with violence or danger. But the image is hard to shake. A small pink jacket, pink and white Velcro shoes, a pink and purple bike taken apart and placed inside a hidden concrete pipe. The colors made it worse somehow. They were bright, childlike colors. They did not belong in that dark place. They did not belong in a damp concrete tunnel buried in dirt and moss at the bottom of a ravine. I can still picture the contrast. The dark gray concrete, the wet earth, the rotten plywood, the green moss, then that pink jacket sitting inside. It looked out of place in a way that felt almost deliberate. The ravine itself was already the kind of location people would choose if they wanted something to stay hidden. It was hard to access. You could only get there from the beach at low tide. The steep sides made it difficult to leave any other way. Most people would never wander deep into it. And among all the old pipes, one had been buried and sealed. That is what has made me keep thinking about it for more than 20 years. I have tried to tell myself that there was probably an explanation. Maybe someone had used the pipe as a storage space. Maybe a child had played there once and left things behind. Maybe a parent had stored old belongings there because they did not have space somewhere else. Maybe the bike was broken, the clothes were outgrown, and someone had hidden them with plans to come back. Maybe the lock and wood were meant to keep people out, not to hide something from them. But every explanation falls apart a little when I picture the condition of the barrier. It had been there long enough for the wood to rot, long enough for moss to cover it, long enough for the pipe to become part of the ravine itself. Whatever was inside had not been left there for a day or two. It had been hidden. That word is hard to avoid. Even now, I do not claim to know what happened. I do not want to turn an unknown situation into a story with a conclusion that may not be true. I have no proof that a crime happened. I have no proof that the belongings belonged to a missing child. I have no proof that anybody was hurt. But I also cannot pretend it was not disturbing. I have been to abandoned places since then. I have seen old buildings, hidden rooms, broken down sheds, and forgotten items left behind by people who moved away. Most abandoned things are just abandoned things. Old furniture, cans, trash, broken toys, clothes, tools, and objects that no one cared enough to take. But that pipe did not feel abandoned. It felt concealed. There is a difference. An abandoned space is open and forgotten. A concealed space is closed because someone does not want it found. That is what I remember most clearly. The plywood, the 2x4, the padlock, the fact that we had to kick the barrier in to see what was inside. If it had been an open pipe with a child's old belongings in it, I might have assumed someone had used it as a hiding place while playing. It would still have been odd, but not necessarily alarming. But it was blocked. It was locked. And inside were things that looked like they had been separated from a child. Over the years, I have wondered whether the police even found it. The ravine is not easy to access. The tide matters. The ground is difficult. The pipes are scattered everywhere. Maybe they had to wait until the water went out. Maybe they arrived too late. Maybe something had changed by the time they got there. Or maybe they found everything, took it away, and investigated quietly. Sometimes police do not tell people what happened after they report something, especially if the people reporting it are kids. Maybe there was no reason to update us. Maybe they did not know who we were after the initial report. Maybe they looked into it, found nothing useful, and closed it. I will probably never know. That does not stop the memory from returning. Sometimes it comes back when I see a small pink jacket in a store. Sometimes it comes back when I see a child learning to ride a bike. Sometimes it comes back when I hear people talk about old forgotten places and hidden tunnels. The image arrives all at once. That dark opening, the wet, mossy wood, the hidden pipe, the bright colors inside, and the feeling that we had stumbled into something we were never supposed to find. What makes it especially sad is that I cannot separate the objects from the idea of the child who may have owned them. A jacket is just a jacket. Shoes are just shoes. A bike is just a bike. But when they are child-sized, brightly colored, and hidden together in a sealed place, they stop feeling like ordinary objects. They become evidence of a person who should have been there to use them. That is what I still think about. Not the pipe itself, not the ravine, not the fear of getting caught exploring somewhere we should not have been. I think about whoever wore those little Velcro shoes. I think about whoever wore that puffy pink coat. I think about whoever rode that pink and purple bike before it was broken apart and put into a hidden concrete pipe. And I wonder what happened. It has been more than 20 years now. The ravine may have changed. The pipes may have shifted farther into the dirt. The tide may have washed away parts of the beach path. The old barrier may be gone. Maybe somebody cleared the place out years ago. Maybe the whole area looks completely different now, but I still remember it exactly. The steep walls rising around us, the old concrete pipes scattered through the ravine, the buried opening tilted toward the sky, the rotten plywood covered in moss, and the small pink things waiting in the darkness inside. I do not know what happened to that poor little girl, if there was one. I do not know whether there was ever a case, an explanation, or an answer. I only know that we found something deeply wrong. We did the right thing by calling the police, and then we were left with silence. More than 2 decades later, that silence is still what haunts me most. When my daughter was a baby, I was sitting in the rocking chair in her room, holding her while I sang to her. It was part of our normal bedtime routine. My wife and I had fallen into the usual pattern that new parents do without really planning it. One of us would get the baby ready for bed, change her, make sure she was fed, and settle her down. Then one of us would sit with her until she got sleepy enough to be put in the crib. That night, it was my turn. Her room was dim except for the soft light we kept on at night. We did not want the room completely dark while we were still getting used to having a baby in the house. The light was low enough that it did not keep her awake, but bright enough that I could see the outline of the crib. The rocking chair, the dresser, and the toys or little baby things that had started collecting in every corner of the room. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet after a baby finally starts falling asleep. There was no television playing loudly downstairs, No music, no conversation, just the small sounds of the house settling and the soft creak of the rocking chair moving back and forth. My daughter was in my arms, warm and sleepy. She had reached that stage where her body had started to relax against me, but she was not completely asleep yet. I was singing softly, not because I had a great voice or knew every word perfectly, but because it worked. It calmed her down. It became one of those little routines that feel ordinary while you are living them, but later become some of the strongest memories you have. I was focused on her. I remember looking down at her face and watching her eyes get heavier. I remember trying to keep the song quiet and steady. I did not want to move too much. I did not want to accidentally wake her when she was so close to falling asleep. The door to her room was open. The hallway outside was darker than the nursery, but I could still see part of it from where I sat. The hallway ran past the room and toward the stairs. I could hear anyone walking through it if they were not trying to be completely silent. At some point, I heard my wife walk past the room. I did not look up right away because there was nothing unusual about that. She had been moving around the house, doing some work, getting things ready, probably handling the 100 small tasks that always seem to exist when you have a baby. Then I heard her voice. "Good night, sweetie." She said it softly, gently, in the way she always spoke to our daughter. It sounded completely normal. It sounded like my wife was standing just outside the open nursery door, looking in as she passed through the hallway. There was nothing strange about it at all. It did not sound distant. It did not sound muffled. It did not sound like a sound from another room that my brain had misunderstood. It sounded like her. I could recognize my wife's voice anywhere. There was no doubt in my mind. It had the same tone, the same softness, the same familiar way she spoke to our daughter. Without thinking, I looked down at my daughter and quietly said something like, "Mommy says goodnight." It was one of those automatic little comments a parent makes. I did not expect an answer. I was not trying to start a conversation. I just repeated it to my daughter as I continued rocking her. I assumed my wife had passed by the room, said goodnight to the baby, and gone downstairs. Nothing felt wrong. My daughter was almost asleep by then, and I stayed in the rocking chair a little longer. I waited until her breathing got slower and her body felt fully relaxed. Then I stood carefully, trying not to disturb her. I moved slowly across the room and placed her in the crib. She settled without waking up. I stood there for a moment, looking down at her and making sure she was comfortable. Then I pulled the blanket into place, checked the room one last time, and stepped out into the hallway. The hallway was empty. Again, that did not seem strange at first. My wife had obviously gone downstairs. I assumed she had been busy with whatever she was doing before bed. I went downstairs. When I reached the kitchen, my wife was there. She was working at the table or counter, doing something she had been focused on for a while. I do not remember exactly what it was. Maybe she was sorting paperwork, working on something for her job, paying bills, or just taking care of things around the house. Whatever it was, she looked up when I came in. She asked me, "Is she in bed yet?" I said, "Yeah, I put her down just after you said goodnight." My wife looked confused. She asked me what I meant. I said, "When you walked past her room, you said goodnight to her." At first, I thought she was joking. It was the kind of thing where you assume the other person has forgotten a small moment that happened only a few minutes earlier. But she had not forgotten. She told me she had not gone upstairs at all. She had been in the kitchen the entire time I was putting our daughter to sleep. I remember standing there for a second, waiting for her to smile or tell me she was kidding. She did not. She was serious. I told her again that I had clearly heard her in the hallway. I told her I heard her walk past the room and say, "Good night, sweetie." I told her that I had answered our daughter by saying, "Mommy says good night." My wife looked at me and said she had not been upstairs. Not once. She had been sitting in the kitchen, where I could see her from the moment I came downstairs. She had not left the room. She had not gone up to the nursery and come back down. She had not walked through the hallway. She had not said good night. She had been doing work the whole time. That was when the feeling in the house changed for me. A few minutes earlier, everything had felt peaceful. I had been sitting with my daughter, rocking her to sleep, listening to what I thought was my wife passing by the room. Now I was standing in the kitchen, realizing that the voice I heard had not been hers, or at least it could not have been her. I remember trying to explain it away immediately. Maybe she had called up from downstairs, and it had echoed in a strange way. But that did not make sense. Her voice had sounded close. It had sounded like it came directly from the hallway just outside my daughter's room. Maybe she had gone upstairs quickly and forgotten. That did not make sense either. She had been doing work in the kitchen. She knew she had not left. There was no reason for her to forget walking upstairs, saying goodnight, and coming back down. Maybe someone else had been in the house. That was the thought neither of us wanted to say out loud at first. But once the idea appeared, it was impossible to ignore. We had a baby upstairs. The house was supposed to be secure. There should not have been anyone else inside. My wife and I looked at each other, and I think we both reached the same conclusion at the same time. Whether it was something strange or not, we needed to make sure nobody was actually in the house. We searched everywhere. We went upstairs first. I checked my daughter's room. She was asleep in her crib exactly where I had left her. The room was quiet. Nothing was out of place. The rocking chair was still by the window. The closet door was shut. There was no one behind the door, no one hiding near the crib, and no sign that anyone had been in the room besides me. Then we checked the hallway. Nothing. We checked the bathroom. Nothing. We checked the bedrooms. Nothing. We opened closets. We checked behind doors. We looked under beds, even though that sounds ridiculous now. But when you think someone could be in your home, especially when you have a sleeping baby upstairs, you stop caring whether you look foolish. You check every place a person could possibly hide. We went through the house top to bottom. The living room was empty. The dining area was empty. The kitchen was exactly as my wife had left it. The basement, if there was one, was empty. Every closet, corner, and room was empty. Nobody else was there. The doors were locked. The windows were secure. There was no sign of anyone coming in or leaving. What made it even stranger was where my wife had been sitting. The kitchen was in a place where she had a clear view of the only doors into and out of the house. She had been doing her work in plain sight of those entryways. If someone had entered or left through the normal doors, she would have seen them. There had been no one. No stranger came inside. No guest stopped by. No neighbor wandered in. No one walked upstairs and spoke in the hallway. And yet I had heard a voice so clearly that I had responded to it naturally. That was the part that bothered me the most. It was not a vague noise. It was not a whisper in the middle of the night that I could later blame on the house settling or a television playing in another room. It was a sentence. "Good night, sweetie." It was spoken in my wife's voice. It was gentle and familiar. It was exactly the kind of thing she would say, and I heard it at the exact moment when it would have made perfect sense for her to be passing by our daughter's room. That made it harder to question in the moment. If the voice had said something strange, maybe I would have noticed immediately. If it had called my name from an empty room or whispered something threatening, I would have reacted differently. But it sounded loving, normal, domestic. It sounded like a mother saying goodnight to her baby. That almost made it worse after we realized she had not said it. For the rest of that night, I kept replaying the moment in my head. I remembered sitting in the rocking chair. I remembered the nursery light. I remembered the small sound of the chair moving. I remembered hearing someone pass the open doorway. Then I remembered the voice. I tried to think whether I had actually heard footsteps. I was not sure. I knew I had sensed movement in the hallway, but maybe that was because I heard the voice and naturally imagined someone walking past. Memory can be tricky, especially when something happens that you do not understand. You replay it again and again, trying to separate what you truly heard from what you assumed. But the voice was not something I questioned. I knew I heard it. I knew it sounded like my wife. My wife tried to stay calm about it, but I could tell it bothered her too. She had been in the kitchen the entire time. She knew exactly where she was. She knew she had not gone upstairs. She also knew that the house had been locked and that she had a clear view of the doors. If there had been another person in the house, there was no obvious way they could have entered or left without being seen. The next few nights felt different. Nothing major happened right away. There was no second voice, no figure in the hallway, no doors slamming, no baby monitor picking up strange sounds. The house did not suddenly become a haunted movie set. But after something like that happens, ordinary things begin to feel different. A floorboard creaks, and you wonder who stepped there. A shadow in the hallway looks darker than it did before. You hear a pipe shift or a vent make noise, and your mind immediately remembers the voice. You start listening more closely than you used to. That is what I did. When I put my daughter to bed after that, I became much more aware of the hallway outside her room. I would sit in the rocking chair and listen to the house. I would look toward the open door more often. I would notice every small sound. Sometimes I shut the nursery door more fully. Sometimes I left it open because I wanted to hear if anyone came upstairs. It sounds irrational, but when you have a baby, you are already alert. You listen for every little sound they make. You wake up at the smallest cry. You check the monitor too often. You worry about things that did not seem important before you became a parent. After hearing that voice, I was even more watchful. I did not want to admit I was unsettled. I did not want to frighten my wife or turn one strange incident into something bigger than it was. But I kept thinking about one question. Who said goodnight to my daughter? I know there are logical possibilities. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was in that half-focused, repetitive state parents get into when they are rocking a baby to sleep. Maybe I heard a sound from downstairs and my brain turned it into my wife's voice because I expected her to be nearby. Maybe there was a television or radio somewhere in the house that briefly made a similar sound. Maybe a neighbor outside said something, and the sound carried in a strange way. Maybe I had dozed off for a second and dreamed it. That is possible too. Sitting in a rocking chair with a sleeping baby can make you more tired than you realize. Maybe I was drifting in and out of sleep. Maybe my mind created the voice because it was such a familiar part of our routine. But it did not feel like a dream. I was awake. I was singing. I was holding my daughter. I responded to the voice right away. And the sentence itself was so specific and so perfectly placed in that moment that it is hard for me to write it off. My wife's reaction made it harder too. If she had laughed and said she probably did walk upstairs without remembering, I might have forgotten it. If she had told me she was joking, I might have felt relieved. But she did not. She was just as certain as I was that she had never left the kitchen. There was no dramatic conclusion. We did not find a hidden person. We did not discover that a relative had stopped by. We did not find a speaker, a recording, or anything else that explained it. We searched the house, found nothing, and eventually had to accept that we did not know what happened. That is what made it linger. Some strange experiences end when you find the cause. A noise turns out to be the furnace. A shadow turns out to be a coat hanging on a door. A voice turns out to be a television in another room. Once you know, your body relaxes. This did not have that ending. The voice was real enough that I responded to it. My wife was not upstairs. Nobody else was in the house, and my daughter was asleep in the room where someone or something had just told her good night. Even now, I do not know what I believe about it. Maybe it was my tired mind filling in a sound. Maybe it was a strange echo from another part of the house. Maybe it was a moment of confusion that became sharper in my memory because of what my wife said afterward. Or maybe something stood in the hallway outside my daughter's room, sounding exactly like my wife, and spoke to her while I sat only a few feet away. I do not know, but I still remember the warmth of my daughter in my arms, the gentle movement of the rocking chair, the quiet nursery, and that familiar voice from the hallway. "Good night, sweetie." At the time, it was a completely normal thing to hear. It only became frightening when I went downstairs and found out that my wife had never said it. The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.